Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, it's my honor and pleasure to speak to you as both the director of the Geneva Center for Security Policy, but also as the co-chair of the International Gender Champions Impact Group on Women, Peace and Security. At our center, the GCSP, our objective is to foster international cooperation, bringing people from across political divides to develop mutual understanding and trust. We aim to facilitate inclusive and safe spaces for learning and dialogue. Yet today we recognize that some people are being pushed to the margins, and their work to advance peace and security, human rights and human dignity is not visible or integrated into decisions and policies. And some are not even safe to raise their voices, especially women human rights defenders. This is why we are delighted to be co-hosting this event with two civil society organizations which support and elevate the voices of women at the sharp edge of peace and security, and that is the Nobel Women's Initiative and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. It is also critical that today we connect with those who do have influence here in Geneva and beyond. We are proud to be doing this through the International Gender Champions Network and all of you here in person and online. So welcome to all of you. This conversation, Beyond Power and Territories, Women, Rights and Systemic Approaches to Sustainable Peace, seeks to address a number of highly relevant and interconnected issues. Firstly, we will look at how current power dynamics, competition for resources and territory, and violent conflict are impacting everyday lives. You will hear from women directly impacted by insecurity who are leading responses with their communities to advance human rights, including land rights, human dignity, and justice. Their leadership is not soft, although many are leading with compassion. It is grounded in the realities of the needs of their communities and practical solutions that build trust, accountability, and sustainable approaches. From questions of mineral extraction and disputes over territory, to concrete measures to ensure that ceasefires are effective, from drones to data, they are working to ensure that basic humanitarian needs are met, human rights are protected, and parties in dispute talk. They will help us to ground our conversation in realities that many of us are removed from. Amrita, yeah, there she is. Amrita Kapur, fellow gender champion and moderator, will pose a question to our experts, Nina Potarska, Violeta Vasquez Alcantara, and Catherine Turner, which I invite us all to consider. Is the current drive towards securitization and militarization actually leading to more security and peace, or is there another path? This leads us to a second question. What is the role of human rights, including land rights, and more systemic approaches? 25 years ago, as governments and civil society analyzed the impact of two world wars, colonialism, armament, there was a consensus in the UN Security Council. Not only are women's roles in maintaining and promoting peace and security equally important as men's, but we need a framework for an integrated approach that addresses root causes of violence and insecurity. The Women, Peace and Security Agenda was born and resulted in over 108 national action plans, NAPs, local, national, regional networks for dialogue and policy development. The agenda creates whole-of-government reporting and accountability mechanisms, examines the drivers of and responses to violent extremism and sexual violence in conflict, and helps to ensure our peacekeeping missions and security institutions are effective. While international relations and multilateralism are at a very different juncture to 25 years ago, as a historian, I profoundly believe that we must learn the lessons from history, see the long-term view, and not be blinded by polarizing narratives of the day. Without doubt, we need to constantly adapt and evolve our structures and behaviors. But let us not fall into the trap of disregarding wisdom that has emerged from the horrors of war and human suffering. Now more than ever, we need to identify ways to prevent further violence and insecurity. And I'm delighted that we have an academic perspective from Professor Catherine Turner, who is also a fellow with our center, to help us connect the evidence to our realities today. Our final question will be to consider how the WPS agenda can continue to be a blueprint for peace and security. Geneva clearly has a role to play in all of these issues, and that is why I, together with Claudia Fuentes Julio, the permanent representative of Chile, and Madeleine Rees, then Secretary General of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, co-founded an impact group on women, peace and security. Amongst our activities have been a debate on gender apartheid, research on the integration of WPS into human rights mechanisms, and partnership and promotion of UN Women's Global Compact for WPS and humanitarian action. Now, for this 25th anniversary year of the WPS agenda, we have launched a campaign, Hear Her Call, which our speaker, Nina, from Ukraine, and I are part of. She did a much better job than I did, you will see. But I do encourage you all to listen to the stories of women from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ghana, Kenya, Iraq, and Myanmar through the QR code that you find on the screen. We also have a Slido to capture your questions as the discussion progresses, and we'll try to integrate them into the conversation. So please use it. Allow me to conclude by saying that today many things are presented as a zero-sum game. You either win or lose. Yet we know that this does not have to be the case when we recognize our interdependencies and move from competition to cooperation and mutual accountability and respect, from siloed thinking to systemic approaches, we can co-create peace. But we need to think critically and constructively to get there. I very much look forward to this conversation, and I'm delighted that another gender champion, Ambassador Tormod Endresen of Norway, will be sharing some closing reflections together with Amrita. Norway has stepped in where others have stepped out and has been steadfast in its commitment to peace, human rights, humanitarian action globally, and through our multilateral system. So thank you all once again, and we are now going to watch some short clips of video documentaries that have been produced by the Nobel Women's Initiative to help us ground our conversation. Thank you.
Мені 24 роки, і на війні я займаюся тим, що я головний медик взводу, а до війни я писала книги та картини. Бачила в вікна, як сусіди всі евакуюються, як чоловіки з жінками, з дітьми сідають в машини, всі бігають, всі метушаться, а ми ходимо і просто і під вечір вирішили, що ми обидва маємо піти теж в Збройні сили. Там неділя – це вже багато. Ну, це ціле життя. Там 2 секунди – це ціле життя. Типу. Я бачила, як снаряд попадає в людину і перероблює її. Тому 2 секунди – це настільки багато, що собі важко уявити. Ну, от якщо ти не бачив цього вживу.
Оце гаубиця. 152 калібр. 152-й, блін. Або щось таке.
Ну как меня понял? Мне нужна резина, а не диск.
Мимо пролетіло. Далі лягло. От. Так що все трохи по-іншому, ніж я собі уявляла. Це стрьомно і брудно. Так, оце от по нам працюють, саме по нам, по нашій посадці. Так, ось так.
Ми сиділи їли борща і такі, давай прийдемо, повінчаємось. Ми пішли, домовились і вже через день нас повінчали. Він розплакався в кінці, батюшка. Взагалі, останнім часом, коли в мене прийшли парою, всі починають плакати, я не знаю чому. Ну, бо це ми купуємо кільця, обручки, плачуть люди. Ми прийшли пити каву, плачуть. Я потискала собачку, плачуть. І ми стоїмо вдвох такі чисті, ну, пішли додому, того, що неможливо просто щось робити нормально.
My fondest memory of going to Lviv was meeting with the women conductors. Not only did they show a lot of strength, but what they showed was that they turned on their humanity. It's easy for me to say, I'm a conductor of a train. That's my duty. But they went beyond, and when you turn on your humanity, you go beyond what you have been asked to do and do what humanity is calling you to do. They went to places that they knew it was a one-way journey, but they questioned themselves through their humanity. If I don't do this, who's going to do it? But beyond that, every step of the way, I saw individuals who were trying to hold life together. I think that was the most beautiful thing to see.
En Guatemala, a menudo nos encontramos con personas que se ven obligadas a enfrentar un sistema marcado por la corrupción y la desigualdad.
Fui mandada a una prisión de máxima seguridad, a donde se me envió con la consigna clara y audible hasta el día de hoy, después que me dijo, así, me mantengo callada. Trabajar por la defensa de los derechos humanos no es tarea fácil, menos cuando esa labor incluye la lucha contra la corrupción y la impunidad y se va en pos de la búsqueda de la justicia, de la legalidad, el Estado de Derecho y el restablecimiento de la democracia. Llevo 7 años lidiando con la persecución que ha generado mi búsqueda por la justicia y la lucha contra la corrupción e impunidad desde la labor que realicé durante 16 años como fiscal en jefe de la Fiscalía Especial contra la Impunidad Regional. De ellos he estado 2 años presa. Como alguien que ha enfrentado la adversidad por mis creencias, por mis principios, y convicciones. Entiendo la fuerza y el coraje que se requieren para desafiar sistemas injustos y promover un mundo más justo y pacífico. Sigamos trabajando juntas para construir un mundo donde todas las personas puedan vivir libres de miedo y en dignidad. Cada voz cuenta y cada acción importa.
Welcome and thank you for joining us today. We're going to start the panel section for today, and it's indeed a great pleasure and a privilege to be moderating this panel. My name's Amrita Kapur. I'm the Secretary General for the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Some of you may have heard of WILF. It is a pleasure to be moderating this conversation, not just because WILF was co-leading the coalition to advocate for Security Council Resolution 1325 25 years ago, but also because WILF celebrates its 110th anniversary today. So it is a real poignant moment to reflect on where we have come and how much further we have to go. And I think what I will start with is just to give you a few notes around how you can join this conversation, including the fact that we will have interpretation. So one of our panelists, Violeta, who we'll introduce in a moment, will be speaking Spanish, and you can access the live interpretation through the QR code and selecting English or whichever language you'd like to hear it in, and following the instructions on the screen. So I mention this to you now so that you can hear Violeta's comments in real time as she's speaking. So let me first introduce the speakers that we have today, and really they speak to what we've just seen on the screen so powerfully, which is how do we start to think of these lived experiences and the wisdom that they can offer for how we conceptualize the WPS agenda for the next 25 years. So on my left, I have Nina Potarska, who is the co-founder of the Women's Network for Dialogue and Enduring Peace. And she's also been working with WILP since 2016. And beyond being a sociologist, a political scientist, and a gender expert on peace building and conflict resolution, she's also been managing a range of different research projects to increase women's participation and ensure gender aspects are taken into account, not just in national and international structures, but also in the complex conflict context that is Ukraine. And I think what's really interesting as a perspective that Nina brings is the narratives that she brings from both sides of the conflict and the type of bridges she's building across communities. So we look forward to hearing Nina on those fronts. We also have Professor Catherine Turner, who is a professor of international law at the Durham University and is also the Deputy Director of the Durham Global Security Institute. So her work sits at the intersection of international law and global policy in the field of international peace and security. Very relevantly, she has a particular interest in peace mediation as a tool for prevention, management, and resolution of armed conflict, something that we will be unpacking today. And I think what Catherine brings today is really this research and evidence-based analysis that is the complement to the lived experiences that we'll be hearing both from Nina and from Violeta. So turning to Violeta, Isela Violeta Vasquez Alcantara is the coordinator of the Antonio Esteban Human Rights Center in Mexico. And so here in this capacity, she works to defend land and combat the dispossession of rural and indigenous communities and provides psychosocial care from a popular education and gender perspective to survivors of human rights violations, including disappearance, murder, and obstetric violence, among others. So again, Violeta will be bringing a very distinct Indigenous and intersectional approach to the type of conceptions of peace that we might be exploring. So by way of kicking off this panel, the first question that I'm going to ask the different panelists, and I'll first ask Violeta and then Catherine and then Nina, is to really understand a little bit more about how a securitized approach to peace can create more problems than it solves. And before we delve into this question, I just want to frame a couple of, I think, reflections to frame this conversation on this 25th anniversary, because we are in a moment of increased militarization and unprecedented spending limits. Some of you may know that Wilf launched a campaign called Move the Money in recognition that what funds are directed to military are not going to peace, human rights, gender equality. And so at this moment, just as the opening remarks mentioned, it is a moment to conceptualize of how do we transform and transcend this current dynamic. And it's certainly not something that we can expect to be easy, but I think this is where we want to meld this wisdom from lived experience around what people have seen on the ground as the effect of securitization, and then be able to pivot to understand, well, what works in the face of this. So that's broadly the way that this conversation will go. And so Violeta, maybe I can turn to you first. If you can tell us a little bit about your lived experience around how securitization, particularly of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, has created more problems than it's solved. Over to you.
Bueno, pues en principio gracias por estar acá, por la invitación. Estoy contenta de poder platicar este enfoque pues desde la región de Latinoamérica. Y bueno, pues nosotros tenemos una experiencia en un territorio que está fuertemente marcado por la violencia que causa el narcotráfico y también por los procesos de defensa del territorio frente a los intereses de empresas y corporaciones que intentan llegar a Latinoamérica para hacer uso pues, de los recursos naturales. La mayor parte de estos recursos naturales están en territorios indígenas y en ese mismo proceso una respuesta desde el Estado, desde los estados, eso sí, a región de Latinoamérica, pues ha sido responder con un mayor gasto público a la militarización, incluso sacrificando los recursos que serían necesarios para garantizar derechos básicos como agua, salud, acceso a caminos dignos. Y por otro lado, también hemos visto la militarización en zonas de las fronteras, es decir, ha impactado sobre el paso de personas en situación de tránsito, especialmente a migrantes. También hemos visto la militarización en zonas que tienen tradición de organización y de resistencia especialmente. Entonces, ahí la militarización, en lugar de asegurar o de hacer que la gente se sienta segura, que bajen los índices de, por ejemplo, de homicidios, de actos de violencia de alto impacto, lo que ha causado pues es que las comunidades no puedan organizarse, sean intimidadas cuando, por ejemplo, quieran hacer frente a un proyecto de los que nosotros llamamos de muerte. Si hay una manifestación, vemos la presencia de los órganos, desde los más locales hasta los federales, en cuanto a las fuerzas de seguridad. Pero si vemos que alguien fue asaltado, si hubo una mujer que sufrió violencia sexual, entonces difícilmente se va a acceder a la justicia. Nosotros pensamos que es importante buscar un enfoque de paz, pero con dignidad y con justicia, que se puede ir tejiendo desde los territorios y que pues no puede tener este enfoque tal vez intervencionista o colonialista. Aquí dejaría esta primera intervención.
Thank you so much, Violeta. And I think what's really interesting there is how clearly that intersectional experience becomes relevant to how we understand where the challenges are, and then obviously where we can find some types of solutions. So I'll turn next to Catherine. Can you tell us a little bit from your research, the type of evidence and analysis that might lead on and build on from what Violeta's shared before we return to some of the reflections in Ukraine? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Amrita, and to the GCSP for the invitation to take part in this panel today. So in terms of this move towards securitization that we're talking about, I suppose what I see is a worrying trend that we're seeing as a community of people interested in keeping women peace and security on the agenda, is that conflict and insecurity in people's everyday lives increasingly seem only to matter if it can be demonstrated that these insecurities also represent a threat that can be scaled up to the national security level. And the diversion of funding and money away from conflict and from overseas development towards defence and security is simply, I think, the most visible example of this. But I think with this, it's becoming too easy to dismiss the effects of conflict on local communities as somehow less relevant than geopolitical challenges. But let's think for a moment about what national security is, if it's not about the lives and the livelihoods of the citizens of a state and of the people of that state. So have we returned to a position where the state is once again seen as an abstract entity that is somehow separate from the individual? A state as an entity with interests that are separate or that diverge from the individuals and the communities that make it up. And I would argue that in reality, those two are intertwined. And so we can look at this from two different perspectives. First of all, we can look at it through the lens of security. So in this sense, security is sort of our response to a threat that we perceive to our own well-being. And this tends to be defined in a relatively short-term frame, the goal of neutralizing the threat. Okay? So a ceasefire, ending of violence, that sort of thing. Peace, on the other hand, which is where we're usually much more comfortable working in the peace space, peace is defined here as the state that we seek to achieve and tends to be thought of in much longer term terms as a long-term endeavour. And so if we get stuck looking only at security, and particularly only at immediate and high-level transnational threats, then we risk missing this interdependence between the two. And while the high-level threats are often more visible, or they can be portrayed as potentially more catastrophic, ultimately, it's human perceptions of security and other concepts such as dignity and justice in everyday lives that will drive human behaviour and thus conflict. So, for example, I recently completed a piece of work with the GCSP here, looking at the Maputo Accord process in Mozambique. And there we were trying to understand why this particular process of talks had succeeded in reaching an agreement where a number of previous initiatives had failed. And I think there are two quite salient features here. One was the ability of the parties themselves to talk to each other in a constructive way with a common goal. And I think this is something that is currently being radically undermined by political polarization across the world. And the second was the acceptance that human dignity, and particularly claims around pension justice, weren't only drivers of violence, but that they were going to be central to the agreement, no matter how difficult it was going to be to agree on that. And so the history of failed processes that was the context for these talks demonstrated that these deals that don't acknowledge human costs of elite level conflict and elite bargaining will ultimately be unsustainable, and they have the potential to stabilize not only states, but also regions and in border areas. And even domestically in European states, we know that the absence of civil institutions and a sense of any connection between the individual and the state is associated with weaker social resilience to disinformation and to polarization. This in turn then undermines public discourse and weakens trust in the very political institutions that we rely on to respond to military threats. And so in a world where leaders are increasingly treating their interests as separate from those of their populations, and where the capacity for holding leaders to account seems to be breaking down, the failure to see the connections between our own social policies and our resilience to transnational threats means failure to see the systemic nature of insecurity. And similarly, just to finish, if we focus exclusively on external state actors and we see security through this state-level prism, then we miss the threats posed by other potentially more influential actors. So we miss, for example, the role of the defence industry and the weapons manufacturers in maintaining militarised logics for private gain. We miss the role of private finance and business, and particularly the extractive industries, in creating instability through dispossession, human rights violations, and subnational conflict. And we also miss the crucial mediating role of the tech companies who provide the tools for transnational threats, such as disinformation and online violence against women and girls. And these actors are arguably more dangerous than most states, but yet they fall outside the state-centric defense and security paradigm that we seem to be gravitating towards. And so where we lack the tools for meaningful accountability of private actors within the human rights system, an effective security response in terms of regulation is going to be more and more difficult, and will only be possible if we see security as a systemic issue that populations are able to understand. And so our challenge here, I think, then, as a community of people interested in peace and in women's rights, is to think creatively about how we use these tools that the Women, Peace and Security agenda has given us to highlight these blind spots and to advocate for effective responses.
Thank you, Catherine. That's a really comprehensive overview of how everything is interrelated. And I think as you were speaking, I was just reflecting on, how we've learned these lessons before. Actually, for the 20th anniversary, we did some analysis on 1325, and one of the barriers to implementation was accountability, or the lack of accountability mechanisms. And so we see that mirrored not just in the WPS agenda, but across national levels and international institutional lack of accountability as well. And so I think we see the ripple effects from the local to the international here. And what I'd like to do is then turn to Ukraine a little bit, and really the value here is to sort of see these threads that go from the local to the national, international, and then back down again. And Nina, you've seen this as well in the communities that you work with in Ukraine, and I think an identification of what the impact is on the lived experience when you see this securitization. Over to you.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak. I think I've stuck with this topic for 10 years, even more, because I started since very beginning, since 2015, with the first research about women everyday transformation during the war, women perspective. So, and in Ukraine, of course, this securitization and of peace, and even like meaning of peace, because when you ask people about, because I'm doing an in-depth interview with the ordinary people from both sides, when you asking them what kind of thoughts bothering you before you go to sleep, this is about how you feel secure or unsecure. But if you open your phone and Google in a picture word security, it's nothing about your future or about your kids' future or about everyday risks and threats that you people going through the war, living during the war. So I'm really stuck between. I'm trying to find the practical evidence and justification for our approach to call security and not only a weapon or military approach to finish, like to make a peace, because on the practice level it's difficult to understand how this logic can bring us to the peace if we still increase military spends, if we increase number of parties in a particular conflict. So it's difficult to predict that in the next future, in the next 10 years, we're going to have a peace. So it's probably a wrong way to go. But about securitization in Ukraine, and the main problem that human needs and human are treated as a secondary. After geopolitical, after economical, after many other problems, human security, it's always somewhere on the side. Like, and but humanitarian access and rebuilding trust and everything, like people who live during the war and who close to frontline, or community, or people, displaced people, or divided communities, or communities close to contact line, or even on occupied territories, or new liberated or new occupied territories. They have been like overshadowed by the military logic and the technical negotiation. And my main point is I'm just trying to find the connection between current situation and how we can bring us to the future, and we're supposed to have a peace in this future, because future it's something difficult to shape even. And from my research and dialogue across divided communities, I've seen that that when peace become a security and military project, and even the last week discussion about who gonna have a peace prize, who gonna pay for this peace prize, if we can, like, and the new like news came from UK about peace process in Ukraine, and about the reason why it was I don't know, postponed, or what they're gonna do with this. It's also about money, and about money which supposed to go to the peace or human sector, but it's went to somewhere else or somebody else. And of course, from human perspective and from the local level perspective, many women who live and carry the weight of surviving and care, and on the community level, they support, they help with their labor, unpaid labor, and they invest in their efforts to maintain existence of this community, because care work, kindergartens, even like, because in Ukraine we still have schools which teaching remotely. So it's mean mom need to follow everything related to school, and especially with the young kids, you need to navigate, you need to be present every day. And medical services, it's difficult to reach, it's a problem with the logistic. It's and when investments come in, like, let's imagine that we already building something new after peace agreement, investment always come in with something big. The good example on the level, on the small community level, when local government building the road, but they usually miss to make a pedestrian part because or for our productivity, we need roads, it's logistic, but who cares about people who need to use pedestrian part? And on a community level, it's even for local people, it's easy to explain, because for them, they feel it's on the physical, it's like, you feel like you feel unsafe when you go through the dark streets, and when you're a woman and you go through the dark street, you feel this insecure feelings, and and it's nothing together with the road, because it's a light, and sometimes it's very small things which are usually missing when we are not putting on the corner, on the head of the corner, the idea of human needs. And but with the daily and care work, and the mutual aid and local dialogue and security infrastructure, and we need to understand all these efforts on a local level, like security infrastructure. because it's built sustainability in the community, and then we can scale these results on the country level. And when women organize food delivery, provide psychological support, because even when we call to our kids and we call and we afraid to make them scary because of our worries. So you know how it's usually this anxiety can come from mom to the kids, and I'm trying to protect. Just protect, and this additional psychological support or mental work we doing for our family, for women who are wives of not competence. They also doing this psychological help, and they on a daily basis, and therefore all this social fabric that hold peace together, and the women are key actors who are trying to keep this social fabric together, and therefore they must. We must design the peace building as a process of human-centered recovery, not only demilitarization or demining, or it means enabling local actors, especially women, to co-shape ceasefire monitoring, for example, because they know more than anybody else how they can feel safe. Women or people who live in close to contact line, how they make their life safe, because there was idea, for example, to monitor the ceasefire with the drones. To be honest, I'm still feel really bad when I'm seeing any flight. So I don't want to see any drones in the sky, because it's not like a peace. It couldn't feel like a peace. And just last sentence, I know. So and this humanitarian access and post-conflict reconstruction and all these efforts should be go through the it's approach, maybe it's a lines which we need to use before we trying to do any peace efforts. And to build sustainable peace, we must create space and trust, and build trust. It's not only about controlling territory, it's about life we trying to create after, I don't know, peace negotiation or ceasefire.
Thank you, Nina. I'll just pass this over to Catherine. I think what's really interesting, Nina, is that when we look at security, and you had that juxtaposition at the very beginning between what people feel as being peaceful and secure, and what security is actually then coming full circle to see that, in fact, even in the ceasefire example, it's actually the lived experience of security on the ground that is going to sow the seeds of what might be sustainable long term. And what you've described is so common across many different conflict areas. And I think one of the common themes that I've seen come through this year of the anniversary is that we have at least, but a lot more than 25 years of experience and evidence on what actually works. So it's not that the evidence doesn't exist, but rather whether or not it's been taken on board, adapted and integrated into design of ceasefire mechanisms, into the design of the peace table as well. So I did promise you an interactive dialogue. So the first part of the opportunity to engage in this dialogue is on the screen now. Hopefully we've got behind me and in front of me, which is excellent. So what we'd like to invite you to do is, if you have a question, please feel free to put that into the Slido. You can use the website or you can use the QR code. We will B, if possible, taking questions that have the most sort of votes for them, or those who are most top of mind for a number of people. And we will obviously be turning not just to what does it mean in terms of security now, but also pivoting towards what can be done. But I did see Violeta taking a few notes, and I wanted to give Violeta a moment to be able to respond. Violeta, if you wanted to add an extra sentence or two to this question of security.
Yep. Pensaba un poco en cómo me resuena pues los otros comentarios, en el sentido de que también este modelo de seguridad y de lo que entendemos por paz tiene que ver con este proceso de diálogo que se da o no se da entre la población y los estados, y cómo realmente están representadas pues nuestros ideales, nuestros principios, nuestras formas de construir el mundo, si lo pensamos como pueblos indígenas y pueblos campesinos. Y que más bien muchas veces no existe este diálogo, más bien hay un enfoque de imposición y de lo que podría ser tal vez rentable en términos económicos, o lo que podría ser pues responder más bien a otros intereses que no son necesariamente los de las comunidades. Por otro lado, también creo que es importante pues reconocer que usualmente son procesos históricos. En México no podemos hablar de un año en específico. Por ejemplo, tenemos algunas etapas en lo que se llamó la guerra contra el narcotráfico, y a la población se le explicó que pues todo ese proceso de inversión en armas y de dejar a los militares en las calles era para generar seguridad para el pueblo, y que se iba a hacer un enfrentamiento directo al narcotráfico. Pero en lugar de eso hubo muchísimos daños colaterales, que, bueno, así le llamó el Estado, daños colaterales, y realmente fueron muchas personas que terminaron asesinadas, que fueron desaparecidas. En México hoy, pues somos uno de los países en el mundo con una de las mayores crisis de personas desaparecidas, y no estamos reconocidos como un país que esté pasando por un conflicto formalmente, en lo que se conocería como el concepto. Pero tenemos una crisis de derechos humanos. Y ahora, en los últimos, podríamos decir, 8 años, no ha cambiado tanto el enfoque, porque ahora desde las leyes también se ha reformado, y pues se le han otorgado facultades a las fuerzas militares para lo que antes hacían las fuerzas civiles, es decir, a veces labores de investigación, labores de detención a personas. Entonces eso pues ha incrementado esta crisis y no se ha atendido, y tampoco se ha dado. Nosotros esperábamos esta coyuntura donde se pudiera dar un enfoque tal vez hacia la justicia transicional. Sin embargo, pues no se ha dado este diálogo constructivo con las víctimas desde las comunidades.
Thank you, Violeta. And one question from the audience, which builds on what you've just said. There's a question from the audience as to whether or not having a female president in Mexico has changed the approach at all. Is there any shift in WPS? And just very briefly, and we'll turn to some more questions.
Bueno, tal vez no va a ser, no sé cómo se va a tomar mi respuesta, pero tomaré la libertad de decirlo con franqueza. Ha cambiado el discurso, pero en términos de políticas públicas no vemos todavía algún cambio. Es cierto que, por ejemplo, ahora existe una Secretaría de las Mujeres desde el nivel federal, pero es una secretaría que no tiene presupuesto, que no tiene políticas públicas claras, que no ha impulsado una agenda pues con las necesidades nuevamente para atender y escuchar a las mujeres. como quisiéramos o incluso pues con un nivel al menos aceptable. También es un poco lo que decíamos antes. Por ejemplo, nuestra presidenta ha dicho en algún momento: soy presidenta y soy jefa de las fuerzas militares. Es como si eso fuera un gran logro, como si, no sé, realmente entonces solamente estamos reproduciendo el mismo discurso que tenían, pues que podría tener, por ejemplo, pues las mismas otras posturas, pero ahora desde la voz de una mujer, lo que nos parece también grave, porque tal vez entonces se está utilizando, se está instrumentalizando a nuestra figura como mujeres para decir, bueno, es pertinente porque lo está diciendo una mujer. Y creo que no es el único caso que se ve en el mundo. Podemos...
Thank you, Violeta. And obviously, as you are speaking it reminds me, and I'm sure some of us, of a phrase that's been used very frequently this year, which is you cannot destroy the master's house using the tools of the master. And I think this is when you speak to instrumentalizing and the fact that there is a reproduction of the same type of patterns and the replication of the absence of funds and resourcing, we see that pattern. So we are going to take a couple more questions. We have one that's specifically for Ukraine. So Nina, the question is, how do you respond to those who argue that Ukraine, not being the aggressor, must militarize and has no option but to militarize? And I think this is a really topical question, and I'm going to say right now, there's no expectation that you have the answer because no one else has solved it yet.
Yes, it's not the first time I hear this question, and it's really so we can. So I'm trying to be on different levels when I'm thinking about this, the answer on this question, because from one perspective, because I'm just back from Ukraine, I spent last week in a beautiful conditions without light, under the shelling. I moved from my brother's apartment because it was hit by rocket. So it's like normal everyday life. And during the staying under the shelling, you can direct all your angriness toward the neighbors who, I don't know, still annoying us with this, I don't know, new dimension, because I still cannot accept this idea, like, because this war happened, it's just like a mistake. Because still not clear how we can stop it, or to whom we need to talk to even to about ceasefire, because and from the local perspective, of course, I want to defend my house, I want to defend my community, and I want to defend my family, and the only way how we can do this, it's with a physical way. But the next level, I still have a friends, and it's a little bit banned from both sides, but I'm still in touch with the people from occupied territory. And it's not a crime, and I cannot even feel like it's a crime, and I'm going to continue to be in touch with them. And I understand that from the other side, people was first mobilized to fight with Russia. From Ukrainian side, some of my friends was volunteered to go to the army, and also there is many people who was drafted to the army by force. And you imagine these guys who was mobilized by force from both sides, are they like really productive on the front line? They have no motivation to fight, because for them it was everybody had different reason why they don't want to fight or why they want to fight. So it's this level still exists too. Next level, it's food security, agriculture, and they all recently, I think it's published on a few resources about war waste and food security, because all these weapons, all these bombs, they landing in Ukraine. And for how many years it's gonna go, nobody knows. But all this war waste, it's all I don't know, Mendeleev table. Everything in the air, everything in the water. We cannot use our forests, we cannot use our fields. So from this perspective, it's difficult to increase the level of using the weapon. And from the other hand, we still have families who divided between by the contact line. So some people live, family members live in the occupied territory, some live on unoccupied. And I know many people when the father still in Donetsk or Lugansk region, and son in Ukraine, and both was mobilized. What are we gonna do with this? And this is very sad, because from the global perspective or from theoretical frame, it's easy to talk, it's easy to finish or to demand something, but from everyday life perspective, it's difficult to make any decision. I don't know where is it truth, or I don't know how we can I don't know, pick this space together. No idea. But from the level of communities, yes, it's possible. But just building trust, just legal frame, it's really helpful. Because if we still cannot ban any hate speech or any dehumanization, it's difficult to build trust and peace, because we're still dealing with the recognition, with the dignity, with the recognition of the dignity of other person, because it's very easy to dehumanize your enemy in a few days.
So it is perhaps the moment to segue into a question around what could each of the panelists think about to recommend to states or civil society, those in the room today, to overcome some of the current challenges to achieve the vision of the WPS agenda. And here what I'd like to do is turn to Catherine and just mention one of the questions that's come from the audience, which I think will speak to your reflections, which is also to ask, how can we build better coalitions and integrate WPS, given the silos in peace and security work, and perhaps even extending, as Nina was talking about, into human rights. So maybe a little bit on that. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I think over the years, as I have thought about participation particularly and the meaning of it, you know, we've come from this place with sort of set ideas around what peace and dialogues and processes should look like. And I think and while participation has been really central pillar and all of that, I think that our conceptualization of it has perhaps been too narrow. And that at the moment, you know, we talk about fragmentation and conflicts, fragmentation of actors, fragmentation of peace processes. But to me, there is potential in that, in terms of how we think about participation, how we think about what it means, and about how we support it. So notions that move beyond sort of an instrumentalized logic, whereby women's contributions are only valuable if they advance dominant peace and security kind of stories or processes or structures, to one where sort of the work that women do, the risks that they encounter, and all of the different places in which this work happens, maybe because it really is a web, you know, and we've become better in terms of localization and recognizing women's local contributions, but I think that we can do much more in terms of recognizing kind of the variety of those spaces, and specifically the value of those spaces on their own terms, rather than in this instrumentalized or hierarchical system, and to make sure that that work is properly recognized and valued. And so I think the challenge going forward with this is, and we were talking a little bit about it this morning, is safe participation, in terms of if we have a decline in sort of the normative safety net around women, peace and security that we've had for the last number of years, like what does it mean to create that enabling environment for women's leadership and for women's participation in peace and in security? And I think that there really is great potential for closer dialogue between women, peace and security on the one hand and human rights, particularly on this agenda. And so, and I think this tunnel vision is a little bit, it's made by the institutional systems, you know, that we can spend our entire careers from we're students right through to sort of mid-career professionals, not knowing that there's another like adjacent branch working on exactly the same thing, using some of the same terms, but slightly different kind of meanings or through different institutions and different processes. But yet we have so many points where these should cross over and they don't always do that. And for example, like we have already overlapping literatures on threats to women's rights defenders and on women peace builders. Specifically, we've got case examples from Libya and things like this, but it exists more broadly. And I think that this demonstrates one of the key barriers, you know, in relation to doing this. And so I think being able to see better the intersecting layers of women's participation, kind of not only high profile and political sort of actors who face very real physical threats when they're in the public eye, but also kind of the what is it that enables women to participate at every level, and what are those everyday securities that allow women to lead meaningful lives, and so how do we provide that support to civil society actors on the ground where it needs to be deeply context sensitive to ensure safety. And like to return to what I said in the previous comments, is conflict and insecurity for women at the local level isn't going to end simply because the world's attention has turned elsewhere, you know. And so I think it's important now more than ever that we continue to acknowledge this and to resource it. And that this local support goes hand in hand with global leadership. Okay, in particular, the need now more than ever for influential countries, influential actors to be advocating in global spaces at the global level for women's rights, for women's participation, and for women's protection. And they're not separate fields of policy that happen only in Geneva or only in New York or only in the field in the mission setting. They're intertwined and they require this holistic response to reorient towards the reality of women's lives. So participation needs to be widely diffused and promoted for the purposes of enabling secure and meaningful lives.
Thanks, Catherine. We'll probably return to some of the pillars in a moment. But I think what you've alluded to there links to Nina's comments very directly, right? That if you have women being able to express and represent those intersecting experiences from the local up, then naturally you're able to more comprehensively address those challenges. So this overcoming of silos is something which can be by design rather than something that comes about ad hoc. And there are, you know, examples of that. And I think this is, I return to the earlier point that there is evidence around what works in these levels. And the question is, how do we leverage that and amplify that? So it's a good moment to turn back to Violeta to see what type of experiences, positive examples or recommendations would you have from the experience that you have that you would like everyone in the room to be able to amplify?
Hemos trabajado mucho en fortalecer nuestras propias comunidades, los grupos de las mujeres, pero trabajando dentro de sus comunidades. Más allá de fortalecer el trabajo de nuestra organización, nos interesa fortalecer la comunidad, el espíritu de solidaridad, de la conciencia social, del pensamiento crítico, para que desde allí pues nos fortalezcamos en comunidad y desde ahí actuemos en preocuparnos por la otra, en preocuparnos por las otras familias, pero también en preocuparnos por nuestra comunidad. Ese tejido denso, ese tejido fuerte, es el que ha reaccionado realmente ante acciones de inseguridad. Ha sido todo ese conjunto el que ha permitido que de alguna manera las comunidades sigan resistiendo y sigan cuidando y defendiendo su territorio. y desde allí pues también reproduciendo sus propias formas de vida. Creo que nosotros impulsamos también desde esa misma colectividad el trabajo voluntario por la naturaleza, por la comunidad. También hemos generado pues desde esa colectividad que las mujeres vayan participando más en espacios de liderazgo. Las mujeres forman parte de forma mayoritaria en los procesos de defensa del territorio. Las animamos a que ocupen espacios de representación y de coordinación. Sin embargo, no siempre es posible ante pues los asesinatos de personas defensoras del territorio que ocurren en México y en América Latina. Somos de las regiones con los índices más altos en ese sentido. Entonces, aunque hay un tejido denso que refuerza la participación de las mujeres, estas han de alguna forma a veces bajado su participación como representantes por temor a pues los problemas de seguridad que pueda haber. También pensamos que nuestras comunidades han afrontado un trauma social fuerte. Todos los días, justo reflexionábamos acá en la delegación de Latinoamérica, que acá vemos las noticias y vemos noticias variadas de otros países. Y si prendemos la televisión en Latinoamérica, vamos a ver diario una noticia de 4 o 5 muertos, desaparecidos, y eso mismo en las redes sociales. En realidad, en nuestra mente social hay un terror, un temor a que algo pase. Entonces, esto nosotros decimos, no podemos normalizarlo y tenemos que empezar a tratar ese trauma social. Hemos promovido espacios de cuidado colectivo y de diálogo, principalmente entre mujeres. Eso poco a poco pues ha ido pues generando espacios que puedan ayudarnos a enfrentar la violencia y pasar de ese trauma y de la inacción a pues seguir construyendo pues el futuro que queremos. Por otro lado, consideramos también que esto también se debe replicar a nivel internacional, la colaboración, el espíritu de colaboración y solidaridad entre las naciones, más que la imposición, más que la colonización o el extractivismo. Tendría que ser nosotros decimos, pues una relación de respeto a la libre determinación de los pueblos indígenas y pues de la solidaridad internacional.
Thank you, Violeta. And I hear the same threads of what you're saying around solidarity and care that Nina was discussing. And I think this speaks of obviously just resilience, but I would want to add one other reflection on the other pillar of the WPS agenda is the one of prevention. And how much of the WPS agenda as it's currently practiced and implemented largely by state institutions is actually leading us closer to prevention. And something that I have reflected on a lot during the many WPS events this year is that we have these 4 pillars. And Nina, you've been speaking about the impossibility of imagining what relief and recovery could look like, in sustainable terms. Catherine's talked about participation in different levels and how that naturally lends itself to understanding a more integrated and holistic perspective. And of course, at the beginning, Violeta was talking about violations and how protection is relevant. But I want to pose here for the audience that in fact, these other 3 pillars are all in service of prevention. So if we were to reconceptualize what we should be pivoting towards for the next 25 years, I would argue that we want to be looking at how participation, how relief and recovery, how protection have accountable links that are evidence-based and measurable towards prevention. Because if we don't have that link, then all we're doing is becoming better at managing the consequences of conflict. We're not actually getting closer to peace. And I think to some extent, we see that today on the 25th anniversary, where in fact we don't have that link to prevention or the focus of the relationship between the other pillars to prevention. So very briefly, Nino, I wanted to give you just a couple of minutes on any additional recommendations. You've touched on a few already, and then I'd like to ask at least one or two questions from the audience before we close the panel.
Yes, just to highlight one more time that we need systematic approach that link peace, social justice, environment, and human rights. Because if this is included, it's supporting local women initiatives and connect ecological restoration and physical healing and psychophysical healing, and those are not soft issues. It's a foundation to build peace and build human security and sustainable peace. So the WPS agenda need to remain transformative, and we must move beyond the participation, representation, and towards participation and co-creation of trust, of narratives, and our future together. And that requires listening, not only inviting, and design the process together with the people who are suffering, who are living this experience, war experience. And of course, with the help of international agency or international organizations and donors who care about peace. And Geneva can play the crucial role here, linking global frameworks and between all these pillars.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Just to build on that in terms of Geneva, and specifically a question that came from the audience, how do we continue to push the WPS narrative forward in a UN context? How can we offer accountability while also fostering optimism? So just very briefly, Catherine, just a sentence or so, if you'd like to, before we close the panel on this.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's a great question, and it is one that we thought about actually. Not so much driven at the UN level, but by driven at the state level. So if you had a portfolio concerned with women, peace and security, for example, and you mapped out, and we did this in the context of Libya, the sort of this ecological framework of where are the different spaces that this is being discussed, where these issues are coming up. And we talked about the overlapping work there on protection of human rights defenders and peace builders, for example, that there's really clear kind of alliance between Geneva and New York on this. And yet it seems, I mean, my experience is the United Kingdom government, but I'm sure they're not alone in this, that there's quite difficulties of communication, shall we say, across the different portfolios within the different departments. And I think that taking a systemic approach also requires at the government level some sort of coordinated approach to where are our teams who are dealing with this. So, what is the regional team that's dealing with it? What is the multilateral team that's dealing with it? How can they be better in conversation, and how can they be being guided by their in-country team around what the requirements are? And so actually, I would say that at UN level, the chances of success probably you need to be driven by member states themselves in terms of thinking about that from a holistic perspective.
What a beautiful segue, because I'm going to thank all of the panelists for their thoughtful reflections on very enormous issues that cannot be covered in a 5-minute summary. So thank you so much for sharing the lived experience and the reflections. And we are going to take that invitation that Catherine has mentioned in numbers of questions. And I'm going to invite Ambassador Endresen, who's the permanent representative of Norway to the United Nations office at Geneva, to speak to exactly the questions that Catherine just mentioned. So thank you to the panelists, and we'll invite Ambassador to come up as well. Thank you. So, Ambassador, you've had a front row seat to this conversation, which has spanned obviously lived experiences at the very local level to the national level, to the international level and back again. And then we've just been presented with a number of questions around what states might be able to consider doing. But I'd like to start with a really open question, because obviously today's conversation has been broad-ranging. So I'd like to ask, what have you found that's been really interesting or surprising, or a reflection that you think might stay with you?
Thank you, Amrita, and good afternoon, everyone. It has been really, really interesting, I find, to be part of this discussion. And what we have been getting at is sort of the difference between state security and human security. And I agree, very often, these two concepts are different things. And I'm grateful to Violeta and to Nina for sharing their perspectives from a very sort of human security, from the ground in a way. But I like to register also that in my opinion, sometimes state security and human security coincide. I was thinking of this young female soldier in the trench in Ukraine, fearing incoming heavy artillery from her neighboring state, who has invaded her country in an illegal war. Of course, both for Ukraine as a state and for her as a person, what she needed in that moment was to counter that incoming fire. So there are instances where military means are necessary. This being said, I think I also took away very powerfully from you, Nina, that of course the big success in Ukraine is the resilience of the civilian population, the way you described how 80% of the territory, the free Ukraine, still working, school, kindergartens, social fabric you mentioned. I mean, the resilience of that social fabric is a so big chunk of what you can call the Ukrainian resistance. It is certainly not defined out of military capacity alone. And we, as a country, as my country, Norway, we would very much see Ukraine negotiating for peace settlement and for ceasefire and all of that, but we want you to do that from a position of strength. And in the short term, then, military assistance is important. But that is why we have designed our long-standing commitment to help Ukraine with a component that is military, one that is humanitarian, and one that is civilian, in the hope that, sooner rather than later, we will be looking at reconstruction. And in the post-conflict period also, of course, the social fabric and the social infrastructure is super important. Then I also took from you, Amrita, the prevention part, how important that is when we look towards the future for the women, peace and security agenda. And I'm often struck in Geneva how much of the work we do that can be viewed through this lens of prevention. For my country, we are invested in human rights promotion, in global health, in making sure that humanitarian assistance, even though resources are shrinking a lot, are still as effective as possible. And all of these things, I think, is contributing to stability and to conflict prevention. So indeed, a lot of the work we do here is around that. And the same goes for the Women, Peace and Security agenda. I think it is a very valid framework still. It is a compass, some people say. It's a norm, like many other norms in Geneva. Not always adhered to, but nonetheless still important. And a yardstick, against which we can measure progress. And there are national action plans, there are networks, there are, in Japan, we do this big network of people involved in the agenda, etc. So there's a whole ecosystem, I guess you can call it, around that agenda, which is important. But for that reason, because we measure progress, we also know that we haven't been able to get as far as we should. So what can we do going forward? Do you want me to continue, or do I?
I'm really eager to hear you answer that question. What do we do going forward? Yes, please. That was absolutely going to be one of the questions, particularly in these challenging times. Please share your pearls of wisdom.
I met with Amrita, in preparation to this meeting, and we agreed sort of, certain script, but I came to realize that I was jumping ahead of my super. No, because that's the important question, of course. What should we then do going forward to make sure that this becomes more of a reality? And you know, one thing which is easy to say is, of course, that we need to secure funding for women to be part of all stages of conflict. And you know, this is easy to say, but I say it knowing full well that, you know, funding has been drying out in a very serious way. The UN Women has been doing a survey on this, the details of which I can't recall now, but I mean, more than half of women-led organizations have been cut back in funding. So and we are, as Norway, Ambassador Greminger said that we were stepping forward with it, where others step back. I hope that was true. On this, we have been able to step forward a little bit, but we also realized that, you know, we cannot fill this enormous gap of American funding that is no longer there. So funding is one thing. We need also to combine this with broader support to efforts to transform power relations in the long run. I mean, it's a reflection of power relations more broadly, and women that speak up must also be able to do so securely. Yes, so that's some of the things that we need to do. But I feel that we're really not in a good place right now. I have to be honest with you, because the pushback against gender equality and gender norms is profound, and we're up against a very toxic mix, strange mix in a way of anti-woke that is taking hold even in liberal societies in my part of the world. Misrepresentation of religion, often used to sort of fuel the gender argument, and this idea that, you know, by opposing gender equality, you are sort of reclaiming traditional norms, and by doing that, asserting your sovereignty. That is also a feeling, I think, held by some. So we need to understand this resistance and find out ways to counter it. And I find it very effective to talk about how almost every sort of policy outcome that we are looking for becomes more effectively attained by inclusion. If you want durable peace, you need women at the table. If you want economic progress, you need women in the workforce, etc. And that is less ideologically charged and more convincing when you talk to your opponents. I also think it is important that men speak up on these issues, and therefore I'm glad that this is part of the Gender Champions work. And of course, we need, like we have done today, to listen to women directly and to make, I think, one of the things you set out to do in this event, in a connect between the ground and the policy makers. So that is some ideas. And maybe if I can close by saying that, you know, we are a proud supporter of your organization, Amrita, and thank you for all the good work that you're doing.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm just going to build on that because we had the pleasure of being able to have our annual meeting in Oslo, supported by NORAD and the MFA, specifically on WPS. And one of the clear priorities was to make sure that we were able to bring our partners to the table to be able to speak with their own voices and to make their own recommendations. And what was very interesting is, firstly, that there is the research, the evidence, and then the sort of shared experiences where Norway's approach of being able to provide more flexible funding to support feminist peace actors on the ground to self-determine and co-create what is going to be an important contribution to sustainable peace was absolutely critical to their effectiveness. And what that also meant is that the level of agency and autonomy that these peace actors had was consistently being built. And so when we speak about participation, about leadership, about decision-making in these spaces, it's that very model of support through partnerships that allowed these peace actors
to be as effective as they were. And I want to just share one experience shared by a partner from Syria who said, look, I don't have the skill set nor the interest in being able to jump through all the hoops for state funding. But what I really find incredibly valuable, and in this case she was talking about WILF, is that WILF is a partner, a true co-creative partner, not an organisation or an NGO, but rather someone who's really with us on the ground. And so that dialogue between Norway and our partners and members on the ground becomes something which is far more dynamic, far more responsive, and I think fundamentally speaks to the lived experience about what is actually working on the ground. So perhaps that's just a moment to say thank you so much for not just the support, but also for the vision, I think, of looking beyond just the agenda or just security and saying, well, what is it that we need to support in the longer term, particularly in these moments? I think it's being able to stay connected to that vision and those communities that will allow us to be able to find the path through. So on that note, I'd like to thank you all for coming and joining us in this dialogue, and to thank the panelists and to the ambassador for the closing remarks that really remind us why it is that we do this work and what we're hoping to achieve, if not in the next 25 years, maybe the 25 years after that. Thank you so much, everybody.